Well, today in the Matthew Plote court case, facing first-degree murder charges for allegedly killing Melissa Lamesh and setting her home on fire.
Two lovebirds had met in college. One day they got intimated and the girl became pregnant and she was happy. But the guy, he was not ready to become a father. Naturally, their relationship lost its track. But the girl decided to handle everything on her own because she had family support. Everything was fine and she was just 2 days away from her delivery date. Suddenly, a raging fire caught her home and both she and her unborn child died. Is it an accident? Or too much of a coincidence? How did it catch fire? Because the autopsy report revealed something sinister. What are we missing? See, questions are many, and answers we have to investigate. It was the day before Thanksgiving, November 25th, 2020, when the Lamesh family got devastating news about a fire at Melissa's house. Melissa, a 27-year-old EMT, was 9 months pregnant then. That's why she was home alone at the time. Around 4 p.m., the Mount Morris police chief called the family, sounding urgent. He asked if anyone was with Melissa, and when they confirmed she was alone, he said the fire was bad, and they didn't know if she was okay. Melissa's brother Carl had already heard about the fire from a neighbor and called the family too. The news had them all fearing the worst. Would Melissa make it out in time? When the family finally made it to the scene, they were slapped with the heartbreaking news that pregnant Melissa's body had been found lying on the kitchen floor, just in front of the stove. Investigators couldn't immediately figure out what caused the fire, whether it was an accident or something intentional. Melissa was known for being a kind, dedicated EMT, and her family couldn't believe she would have let something like this happen. As the investigation continued, attention turned to Matthew Plote, the father of Melissa's unborn baby. Matt was a firefighter and paramedic who had actually been at Melissa's house earlier that day. He admitted he'd visited her to talk about their finances and the baby that was soon to be born. He also claimed he left while she was making lunch after their conversation. But the fact that he was there itself raised enough suspicions. He tried to suggest that the fire was just an accident caused by Melissa cooking, which some investigators thought might have been him trying to cover his tracks. In most cases, it's the partners, spouses, or ex who turn out to be the culprit. And what made things even murkier was the fact that Matt had been hiding the truth. He was the father of Melissa's baby, something he hadn't shared with anyone. Even he refused to acknowledge his role in the pregnancy, along with his strange behavior after the fire. This made him a key person of interest right from the start. The timing couldn't have been worse, just days before Thanksgiving, and with the baby about to be born. The family was left in shock, struggling to understand what really happened to Melissa. It was November 25th, 2020, and Melissa Lamesh, just 2 days away from having her baby boy, had a pretty eventful morning. She was gearing up for a quiet Thanksgiving with her dad and had been chatting with her sister, Cassie Bale, for about 2.5 hours. The conversation was mostly about the future, especially the baby on the way. But right as the call was wrapping up, Melissa noticed Matt standing at her door. She wasn't thrilled to see him, especially since he'd been showing up unannounced despite the tension between them. Melissa told Cassie she'd call her back, but she never did. Now, Melissa and Matthew had known each other since college. While they'd started out as friends, things took a turn when Melissa told him she was pregnant. She explained to her family that Matthew wasn't interested in being a parent. In fact, he had pushed her to get an abortion, and when she refused, he pretty much ghosted her. And that part damaged their relationship. They had been close for years, and Melissa had hoped he'd at least try to be a part of the baby's life. But instead, he completely rejected her, and that left her feeling betrayed. Despite the drama with Matthew, Melissa had a solid support system in her family. Her parents, Deanna and Gus, and her 4 siblings. They reassured her that she'd have all the emotional and financial help she needed. Melissa had always been independent, doing her own thing, whether it was switching up her hairstyles or changing careers. At 27, she just started working as an EMT after an eye-opening experience in college when she ended up in the emergency room. The care she received there inspired her to pursue a career where she could help others in similar situations. But in 2020, with her due date fast approaching, Melissa had to stop working to prepare for the birth. Though she wasn't worried, her family had her back every step of the way. Melissa had moved back into her childhood home with her dad after her parents split up a few years ago. She was pretty excited about becoming a mom, even though she didn't really talk much to Matthew. They'd exchange a few messages here and there, mostly her sending updates and sonograms, but that's it. Melissa still tried to keep in touch, hoping that somehow her child could have a relationship with both parents. But Matthew? He wasn't on the same page. He chose to keep the whole pregnancy thing secret, even from his coworkers and his boss, Chief Rob Schultz at the Carroll Stream Fire District. According to Schultz, Matthew was the kind of guy who never talked about his personal life, so the idea of him having a baby came as a surprise to pretty much everyone, including his own parents. They didn't find out until Melissa decided to tell them, hoping they'd want to be a part of their grandchild's life. When she broke the news to them, they were quite supportive and even offered help. But it was Matthew was furious because she told them everything. Melissa even had a baby shower to celebrate the little one on the way, and she shared the exciting news that it was going to be a boy. But her happiness didn't last long. Just a couple of months later, on Thanksgiving Eve, tragedy struck, and Melissa's life was suddenly cut short, pathetically, in a mysterious fire. Lead Detective Brian Ketter from the Ogle County Sheriff's Office described the aftermath of the fire: debris everywhere, and the house pretty much destroyed. The kitchen, where Melissa's body was found, was hit the hardest, with the ceiling and walls caving in and smoke all over. But here's the weird part. Melissa's body didn't show much fire damage at all. That raised a lot of questions about what really happened. Michael Pohl, a special agent with the Illinois State Fire Marshal's office, was called in to figure out where the fire started and what could have caused it. Right off the bat, they thought the fire might have begun near the cabinets above the stove. But when they took a closer look, they saw the stove was off and there was no fire damage inside the oven or on the burners. They didn't find any electrical issues either, so they ruled out an accidental cause. Without a clear explanation for where the fire started or why Melissa's body didn't show any signs of fire damage, the investigation suddenly hit a dead end. The investigators also noticed there were at least 3 simple ways to get out of the house, with most of the place being accessible except for the kitchen. So they figured Melissa could have escaped if she had tried. Pohl even called the fire a survival fire and questioned why Melissa, being a paramedic used to dealing with emergencies, would try to fight the fire instead of getting out, especially when she's pregnant. Clearly, something was fishy. As the investigation continued, the Lamesh family was interrogated, and they found out that Melissa had spoken to her friend Cassie earlier that day. She ended the call when Matthew showed up at the house. Matt was later contacted by Melissa's brother Carl, who told him about the fire. When Matt was interviewed that evening, he came across as calm and soft-spoken, almost emotionless. He said he went to the house to talk about money and visitation rights for an upcoming hospital induction. But when he mentioned a deadline related to the pregnancy, it raised more questions. Still, the investigators didn't consider him a suspect at that point. Meanwhile, the authorities sent Melissa's body for performing 2 autopsies, one right after she passed and another 2 weeks later. The results were pretty weird. Her carbon monoxide levels were normal, and there wasn't any soot in her system. This meant fire was not the cause of her death. Rather, they found something chilling, and there were signs of strangulation, like hemorrhages around her neck. Not an accident, it was a clear case of murder or homicide. As soon as the Lamesh family got to know about this, they were convinced that Melissa's boyfriend, Matthew, was the one who'd killed her. Turns out Matthew had been involved with other women, and the pregnancy was a huge curveball in his life. Investigators figured that Matthew's selfishness, not financial struggles, was what drove him to murder. After all, Melissa hadn't asked him for anything. He could have walked away, but it seemed like he just wanted to keep everything quiet. They sent off DNA samples from the autopsy to the crime lab and got search warrants for his phone records. They were also waiting on info from Amazon, hoping that the Echo Dot they found in the kitchen could reveal some key recordings, like if Melissa had screamed for help or if there were any other crucial sounds from that day. But this whole case took a wild turn at this point. Suddenly, Fire Chief Rob Schultz from Carroll Stream got involved. He told the investigators that even being a firefighter himself, Matthew had never mentioned anything about the fire to his colleagues, even though he worked in Carroll Stream. But things started looking fishy when Chief Schultz found out that Matthew had called in sick the day of the fire, which made everyone think something was off. As the investigation went deeper, the theory emerged that Matthew might have killed Melissa and their unborn baby because he didn't want to deal with the responsibility of being a father. They also thought he set the house on fire to get rid of any evidence. So Matthew was put on paid leave, and when they told him about the investigation, he refused to talk about it, saying it was a personal matter. Then on August 28, 2021, Matthew was brought in for further questioning. He agreed to sit down for a 7-hour interview without even having a lawyer with him. He told the investigators he had gone to see Melissa to talk about money stuff, like paying her. According to him, they had decided to work it out later, and he left when she started making lunch. But as they kept asking him questions, his story started changing little by little, and suspicions only grew. They asked him straight up whether he went to Melissa's house planning to kill her or if something else happened, but he never really denied it. He didn't stand up for himself or try to prove he was innocent, which made Lieutenant Ketter and the others even more suspicious. When Matthew did speak, his answers were weird. For example, when asked if he meant to hurt Melissa, he said, "I had no intention of hurting Melissa," which sounded like he was admitting to something, but without actually saying it outright. It was like he was being politically correct, so Lieutenant Ketter and the team decided to try something a little more direct. They asked Fire Chief Schultz to wear a listening device during a meeting with Matt on September 9, 2021, hoping to get something useful from the conversation. At first, Chief Schultz was reluctant. He wasn't sure about it, but after thinking it over, he realized how serious the situation was and agreed to help. During their almost 2-hour chat at the fire station, Matt seemed really nervous, constantly saying how nervous and very nervous he was. But when it came to talking about the day Melissa died, he went quiet. Chief Schultz tried to get him to open up by pointing out how strange it was that no one knew Matt was about to be a dad, a moment most people would be excited about. But Matt didn't say a word and just kept his head down. When asked straight out if he had killed Melissa and their unborn child, he didn't deny it or show any remorse. He just stayed silent. Even though they tried to get him to confess through several interviews, nothing came from it, and the investigation kept going, still without any answers. Finally, on March 9, 2022, after a long investigation, they managed to arrest Matthew. The arrest came after a lot of digging, including a fire marshal's report that pointed to the fire in Melissa's home being intentionally set, likely to cover up a murder. But it was still likely, nothing solid or concrete. It took a while to gather everything they needed, including some voice recordings from an Amazon Echo Dot found in the kitchen. But unfortunately, those didn't really help the case. What did confirm his involvement was Matthew's DNA found under Melissa's fingernails, proving he had been there. But in the court, Matthew pleaded not guilty to everything, and his trial finally kicked off in March 2024, more than 3 years after the murder, in Ogle County, Illinois. Matthew's defense team, led by attorney John Kopp, argued that the prosecution had it all wrong when they painted him as this cold-blooded killer who suddenly snapped. They said Matthew was actually a responsible guy who had always been there for Melissa, even helping her out financially. They also claimed that there was no direct evidence that connected Matthew to Melissa's death. They claimed Matthew had actually visited Melissa that day to talk about finances and their future. On the other hand, the prosecution, led by Assistant State's Attorneys Allison Huntley and Heather Cruz, argued that Matthew had murdered Melissa because he didn't want to become a father and was trying to cover up the pregnancy. They pointed to all the evidence that seemed to link him to the crime, claiming he had a clear motive to avoid fatherhood. First, the prosecution brought in fire investigator Michael Pohl, who said he found no sign that the fire was caused by an electrical issue or cooking accident. He was pretty certain that the fire had been intentionally set. But when the defense cross-examined him, they honed in on his report, pointing out words like "most likely" and "it is believed." They argued that those words showed he wasn't 100% sure. Michael Pohl defended himself, saying those were just standard phrases used in investigations and that they didn't weaken his conclusion that the fire was deliberately set. Then the prosecution called in forensic pathologist Dr. Amanda Humans, who had performed the autopsy on Melissa. She testified that there was no soot in Melissa's airways, which meant she had probably died before the fire even started. Rather, she was strangulated, and even shockingly, there were more hemorrhages in this case than any usual strangulation. This just means how brutal the attack had been. Jurors also got to hear some recorded interviews with Matt, where he admitted to being at the house for over an hour the day Melissa was murdered. As we mentioned earlier in these interviews, he said something creepy about a deadline, which prosecutors believed was a reference to the baby's due date on Friday. They argued that this comment meant Matt had a timeline for the murder, with Wednesday being the last day he could do it before the baby arrived. It made it sound like he'd planned to kill Melissa before the baby was born. Another part of the trial focused on how Matt acted during the interviews. Even though he was grilled for hours, he never flat-out denied killing Melissa or their unborn child. The prosecutors found this quite revealing, as it seemed like he couldn't bring himself to lie about what happened. The defense, on the other hand, claimed that Matt's silence was proof of his innocence, saying he wasn't tricked by the investigators. The defense also tried to argue that the fire not completely destroying the house actually worked in Matt's favor. They suggested that if he was really trying to burn evidence, he would have known how to start a fire that would have completely consumed the house. So over the next 3 days, the state built a pretty solid case that Matt had intentionally started the fire to cover up the murder of Melissa and their unborn baby. Finally, after a lot of discussion and back and forth, they claimed the fire should have been labeled as undetermined. To strengthen their case, the defense called in John Knapp, a retired firefighter and independent inspector. He wasn't there when the fire happened, but he looked through reports and photos and pointed out that some important details might have been missed. He even disagreed with the prosecution, saying there wasn't enough evidence to prove the fire was intentionally set. But Michael Pohl accused the defense expert of not really knowing the scene at all. And after a week of trial and only 2 hours of deliberation, finally, the jury found Matt guilty of first-degree murder. The verdict gave Chief Robert Schultz some relief, as this case had been a heavy burden for the firehouse. On June 27, 2024, Matthew Matt was sentenced to life in prison for the murders of Melissa and Barrett, their unborn son. Matt, in his brief statement, said he felt the pain and loss, but his words were met with disbelief from the family, who couldn't believe anything he said. The judge, however, gave him the maximum sentence, making sure he'd spend the rest of his life behind bars, most likely dying in prison. But do you think Matt was really guilty of Melissa's murder? And how do you think the fire started? Was it staged or an accident? Drop your thoughts and theories in the comments section. And don't think this is just one heinous example to cover up a murder by setting fire. If you see this case, you might get traumatized forever. Can you imagine someone cooking the body after killing someone? Watch this then. Subscribe to the channel for more content like this. See you soon.